All right. All right, let me get started here. All right, so we are down to the last 4 lectures of the course. So let's keep going, I guess. We'll see how far we get today. We'll talk about what happens after we finish this. All right, so we're talking a little bit. I'm going to try that again. We're talking a little bit last time about why social media seems to harm girls more than boys, right? We talked about a couple of things, right? A bigger gap, in terms of hours spent on social media to negative mental health outcomes in girls, right? So roughly kind of 3 times more. And there's lots of studies kind of cataloging, the negative effect that social media seems to have on mental health. And we can go back to, Facebook being launched. Okay, I think I ended off on this, right? I had a note for myself to talk about how Facebook knew. So these visually oriented platforms that we have, right? Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, I think TikTok as well, seem to be particularly bad, right? And they are really, really good at one thing, right? It is to maximize the amount of time that its users spend on the platform so you can extract as much information and data as possible. Basically serve up better ads, and then people click on those ads and Facebook makes money. And I mean, I know this. I have one of my good friends, she openly kind of admits, she's like, I think Instagram knows me better than almost anyone, because she finds that whenever she is sort of looking for something, right, the products that are served up to her by Instagram are particularly, most of the time, what she happens to be looking for, right? She really, really, it's like we get together with them every Christmas, and every Christmas for the last 3 years, she's like, yeah, this scavenger hunt thing that you can do. It was, an ad on Instagram, and it's exactly what I was looking for as a family activity, right? These platforms are very good at extracting data and knowing what you want. Okay, the worst platforms for mental health are Snapchat, Instagram, and I would say TikTok's right up there now as well. YouTube is the only platform that's rated as positive. Interestingly, though, it's the one that's most used by boys, right? Boys use YouTube a lot more than girls do. It's a very male-oriented platform. So by 2015, 1 in 7 girls, right? So 1 in 7 women that you meet out there, young women, were using social media 40 hours a week or more. So that is a lot. Okay, sorry, I should have started with this. This is my random Twitter chart for a Monday because, over the weekend I was on Twitter and I saved this and I was like, I'm gonna present this because it actually fits in well with some of the, and I've put it in the mental health thing for next semester, though that won't help you. This is kind of interesting, right? Out of, again, monitoring the future, right? Weighted data using their 2-year buckets, which basically, right, so the data's kind of collected every 2 years. And what you see here, life often feels meaningless. This is your strongly and somewhat agrees, basically kind of thrown together by political orientation and whether they rate religion as important. And I think, again, kind of interesting, you see this difference, very similar to what I was showing you with kind of conservative liberal, but adding religion onto that kind of mix, there does seem to be, some kind of positive protection, for being conservative and saying that religion is important versus, other kind of categorizations, liberal and religion not important, right? You see that mental health indicator, this is just one mental health indicator of life seeming meaningless, right, is much, much worse, as we go forward in the social media era. You're talking better than, a third of people who are liberal and say religion's not important of US 12th graders saying life often feels meaningless, compared to, probably less than 10% here, say 8. It's hard to read from this chart. I have to go digging in the monitoring the future data again and seeing what this looks like. Dust off my copy of R and see what's in there. Yeah, interesting, right? And then our liberal religion is important and our conservative religion are not important, are kind of in the middle, which I do think is interesting. All right, so that's your random Twitter chart I dug up for no reason on a Monday. Okay, if I have, I don't know what happened there. Oh, these are comments from last time. Boys also use socials less because girls don't really like boys who are chronically online. Use social media as feminine. I guess that tracks, right? Maybe, although boys are chronically online in different ways. They're like the Reddit boys and, playing video games all the time. Okay, let's talk about some psychology. Why do I do this to myself? Okay, psychology. We'll couch it as social psychology and it will be okay. All right, social psychology, right? So if we look at kind of psychological makeups of boys and girls, right, they're actually quite similar, right? Now, that said, and again, sometimes this is an unpopular thing to say, and I don't want to go too hard on like a biological determinist path. There are meaningful differences in the psychological makeups of boys and girls. And these are, if we look at kind of anthropology, we look at social psychology, they're pretty consistent across cultures and regions, right, and different eras. Okay, so if we talk about goals, things that more or less everybody wants, two things are agency and communion, right? So agency, what is it? Well, agency is being able to do stuff, right? Striving to individuate and expand the self involves qualities such as efficiency, competence, and assertiveness, right? And competence and assertiveness, I think, are really, really important here. Agency is your ability to do things, right? Kind of go out in the world and be a real actor in it. And communion, right? So this arises from striving to integrate yourself into larger social units, caring for others, and it has qualities like benevolence, cooperativeness, and empathy. Okay, both of these are important, but, and hopefully this surprises no one at this point in your lives, boys tend to focus more on agency and girls on communion. Now, this sort of explains to an extent some of their different patterns of tech use as well, right? Boys, like what can you get agency? Ability to go out and do things, right? Like cool things and heroic things and weird risky things, right? Well, video games are going to simulate agency much more, right? Because you get to walk around, I don't know, with a gun and shoot people, right? You get to, play Black Ops or Fortnite or something, right? And do something cool, right? Versus communion, right? Building bonds with other people, right? Social media is going to tend to simulate that a little bit more as well, right? So we tend to see these differences in psychology, and those technologies exploit them in different kinds of ways. Okay, so 4 reasons girls are particularly vulnerable to social media. Girls are more affected by visual comparison than boys are. Right. Sorry, this is a quote from a Olivia Rodrigo song, which every year I'm like, I should go listen to that song, and then I never do, because, Olivia Rodrigo, and I'm a 43-year-old dude. Right. Because all I see are girls too good to be true. And she wants to throw her phone across the room, right? Okay. So one of the kind of social psychology statements, and again, remember, it's okay if it's social psychology. I got one snicker out of that one. That height sort of stresses is that humans are comparison machines, right? We are constantly doing this thing where we're comparing ourselves to other people, and it seems to be largely to establish a relative status within the groups that we happen to be in, right? And Haidt quotes, I keep forgetting who I'm talking about. I spent the whole day working on something else for a different author, and I keep wanting to say Reeve, but it's Haidt. He quotes Mark Levy in a study he did, where Levy sort of describes humans as having what he calls a sociometer, right? Like a social meter that sort of is constantly measuring where you are in the kind of relative social standings, of a particular place and time. And it's sort of like, a needle, like a speedometer, that's set between 1 and 100, or 0 and 100, right? 0 being like you're totally outcast and you have 0 social status, and 100 being like you're at the top of the pack, right? And it's like something that's going on in the background of your brain all the time, right? Sort of judging your social status, right? Now, what Haidt suggests, again, backed up by a lot of social psychology, is that when that needle drops, right? When your kind of, sociometer goes down, from wherever you were, down to kind of a lower level, it triggers psychological kind of reactions, right? It motivates you, it triggers anxiety, and it motivates you to change your behavior to kind of move that sociometer back up, right? Back up to where you were at least, or higher. Okay, so for girls, right? Teenage girls especially, but I think women in general, girls' social status is more closely tied to appearance than boys is, right? Of course, right, you see the beauty standards, right? We're starting to see an emergence of like stricter male beauty standards, right? Which is why you have more gym bros. But traditionally and more often, right, women are judged on appearance more than men are. I don't think you need a PhD in anything to figure that one out, right? Okay, so when girls got Instagram and Snapchat on their phones, right, it came with things like Facetune, right? And photo editing meant to basically make you look as attractive as possible. And they were exposed to kind of a constant stream of images from influencers, from their friends, that were all sort of these, impossibly perfect versions of kind of female beauty, right? Not to even start to talk about some of the weirder trends that sort of start to pop up, right, around, taking weird pictures of yourself. The butt selfies, were one that will never be cleansed from my consciousness. Thanks for that, Kim Kardashian. Or Belfies, I believe they were called at the time. So, girls' sociometers, Haidt says, basically plunged, right? Because there's all this visual comparison, right? And they know that they don't measure up. Even like subconsciously, they know that they don't measure up to some of the images that are out there on social media. Oh, I just want to check if I have this on another slide. Yes, I have it on another slide. I was going to talk about it. Haidt is a social psychologist, so I'm going to really lean into that one. Sorry, I'm kidding. My hatred of sociology, psychology notwithstanding. Okay, I wanted to point at this image, right? So this, is basically, beauty filters. So this is Josephine Levin, right, on Instagram, basically showing kind of, the way that some of these technologies work. And I'm sure you're more than familiar with it, so I won't belabor the point, right? In this picture, the real her is a hideous monster beyond all words. No, actually, she looks fine, right? But you see, as, different filters are applied, how it enhances things, makes it look a little unworldly, but it's difficult for you looking in the mirror to think you look like that, right? Okay. So, there's always been social comparison, right? This has long been, people play status games, right? We talked about this when we talked about, fertility and Johann Kurtz's kind of argument, right? Status games are something we're all doing all the time, right? We're always trying to raise our relative status within the group. It's just kind of part of human nature. But social media dials that up to levels you've never seen before, because kind of like when I talked about dating, right? That pool of available, partners gets a lot bigger. The pool of people you're comparing yourself to in the social media age gets a lot bigger as well, right? So now girls are competing with impossible images of impossibly beautiful women And not surprisingly, they find themselves lacking. Again, kind of like what Naomi Wolf was saying when she was talking about, pornography, that, women on college campuses know they're competing with, photoshopped porn stars, and they know that they don't measure up to that because no one does, right? It's the same kind of thing for just your average person looking at Instagram. Okay, height suggests girls suffer more from socially prescribed perfectionism, right? We expect a lot of perfection out of girls, and so they try to strive for perfect beauty standards as well. Okay, and much of this actually might operate on a subconscious level. So you might not even have control over it, right? And your self-talk, that you're actually, very good looking or whatever, might not actually help because, some of this seems to happen at an unconscious level. Okay, so French researchers, right, tested this. They did this kind of randomized control study. And basically they exposed young women to images of either very thin or average women. Those who were shown very thin women became more anxious about their body appearance, despite the fact that the images flashed for only 20 milliseconds, too fast for you to be consciously aware of what you're seeing, right? And again, randomized control trial, so some people they showed either very thin or average women to the one who they showed average women to, no real change. That's your control group. The ones they showed very thin women to, said that became more anxious about their body, despite the fact that the images flash so fast, your brain can't actually tell what it saw. But there seems to be some background process in the brain, processing this and kind of setting up your relative status. Okay, and here's a fun chart, right? The sociometer plunge. And again, here we've got our period of the Great Rewiring in gray, right? So that's our 2011 roughly to 2015, or 2010 to 2015 period, right? And what do we see? For both boys and girls, we see a relative decline, in satisfaction with oneself. So boys were more satisfied with themselves to start with, and that drops, right, a little bit from kind of the low 70s to like the high 60s. But you see girls drop, I guess by the end of it, right, it's kind of in the mid to low 60s. For girls, right, it drops a lot more, starting in kind of the mid 60s, or the high 60s, I guess, and dropping, towards just above half of girls saying that they're satisfied with themselves, right? So we see the effect of social media, right? And like I said, it's probably more severe for girls because they're more visually oriented, but I think we're starting to see it in boys too, right? The more, oh my God, if I see one more video about how, you need to lift heavy on YouTube with guys with perfect abs who probably spend their entire day in the gym, I might throw up. I probably will. Okay. Harm number 2. Girls' aggression is more relational, right? So it's more open to using relational tools like social media to hurt people, right? So this one's pretty, I love this headline, by the way. Freya India, she's a really cool writer. If you don't, I would heartily suggest looking her up. She wrote another piece that I meant to assign to one of my other classes. It's really interesting. It's called We Are the Slop. How we all say social media is slop, but then we fill our lives, or we fill social media with our lives. We are the slop. It's a really interesting reflection on how, these companies have convinced us to make our own lives the garbage that we put out there, and structure our lives around social media. Really, really interesting piece. This one, still a very provocative title. Social media is not just making girls depressed, it's making us bitchy too, right? And what does she say? Instagram taps into our competitive psychology and tendency for girl-on-girl bullying. Okay, so female aggression. And if you look at aggression in a kind of wider scope than just like physical aggression, right? Girls and women tend to be just as aggressive as men. It's just that their aggression manifests in very, very different ways. So it manifests in attacking relationships through things like gossip, turning friends against people, damaging someone's reputation, right, by spreading rumors. So this is what a lot of female aggression looks like. It looks very gossipy, very, social in its kind of orientation. Okay, a girl, and like we talk about our sociometer, right? My very good meter here, right? This is any kind of attack on someone's reputation, right, is a sort of attack on their social standing, right? So when girls are attacked in this way, it will often cause either declines in status or perceived risk to status, right? And so they will kind of naturally respond with an anxious kind of response, right? So what does this manifest as? Well, it's all those things that we saw in that mental health unit, right? More instances of self-harm, quite a bit, right? And again, across the board, we looked at a bunch of Anglo-American countries, but again, if you looked at Norway, Sweden, Finland, Germany, France, they're all the same, right? More instances of self-harm, more depression, and more instances of suicide, right? Again, way below the boys, but still there. Okay. Weirdly, the movement to life to social media decreased bullying amongst boys, but increased it amongst girls. And in a lot of ways, bullying for girls got a lot worse because cyberbullying has, a bunch of negative qualities. So things like it follows you, right? It follows you home. It used to be, right, if you were being bullied at school, it's one thing, but when you left school, right, home was relatively safe. But because you take your smartphone with you everywhere you go, to the bathroom, right, to bed, that bullying kind of always follows you around, right? And you're always aware that people are kind of tormenting you, right? And giving you a hard time, right? It's kind of omnipresent. So you never get that psychological relief of even like going away on summer vacation and you're just like free for 2 months of whatever bullying you were facing at school, right? You have a respite, or just that weekend or that evening where you have a bit of a respite. It kind of follows you. So it maintains that kind of psychological pressure. And again, human beings are very socially oriented and very, very sensitive, especially as teenagers, to rejection from the group, right? Because from a biological perspective, from evolution's perspective, getting kicked out of the group is a huge problem for us, right? We're not that good at surviving on our own, especially teenagers. We don't have the skills. So you're wired to read rejection as dangerous, so it triggers anxiety and all of those things. So again, for height, it creates a lot of pressure for girls to monitor their every word and action online, and to be super attentive all the time to risks to their reputation on social media. So it kind of locks them in to defend mode, right? Always looking for threats, always. Which again, if you're in defend mode, you're more likely to be chronically anxious. All right. Number 3, and this is a very interesting one. Contrary to what we might think, right? And this is well documented, but it's a little counterintuitive. Emotions and mental disorders spread through social groups. And we've got a lot of history on this, right? We can go back to, say, the Middle Ages. And there are documented cases in the Middle Ages, right, in kind of chronicles and histories of, it's going to sound ridiculous, what was called the dancing plague, right? And this was where people would become convinced that some kind of supernatural force had taken over their body and was forcing them to dance, right? And dance and dance and dance. And, they would dance themselves sometimes to death, right? They would just keep dancing and dancing until, like, literally they keeled over and died, right, of heart failure or starvation or whatever. They could not stop themselves. And weirdly, this spread from village to village as people moved between and started telling people about this dancing disease that had afflicted the neighboring village. And those who were particularly susceptible to it were women, right? Women were disproportionately affected by the dancing disease. And this is generally the case with a lot of, what might be called social contagions or, emotional and mental disorders, right? Women spread emotions and mental disorders much more readily than men do. And this is an interesting, little number from Tierney and Baumeister from their 2019 study. When a woman becomes depressed, I'm going to highlight stuff because highlighting is fun. When a woman becomes depressed, it increases the odds of depression in her closest friends, male and female, by 142%. When a man becomes depressed, it has no measurable effect on his friends, right? Nobody around him is noticeably affected. So, girls' depression rates rose sharply in the 2010s when a majority of them got on social media platforms, and it spreads. Now, social media appears to be, and I think there's good evidence for this, leading to a sharp increase in what has been kind of dubbed sociogenic epidemics. Some other people call them social contagions, but I think sociogenic epidemics is more correct, right? So these used to be spread face-to-face. Then it was via TV, and now it's via social media, right? And we have lots of examples of this as well, right? Things like eating disorders. Eating disorders tend to travel in groups, right? So if one girl within a group, it's typically girls, sometimes boys, but less commonly, develops an eating disorder, the likelihood of her friends, again, male and female, but more so with women, developing an eating disorder goes up exponentially, right? This is always the kind of caution if you go back to, say, the 90s or the early 2000s, like if one of your daughter's friends, had an eating disorder, that you really had to watch kind of your daughter and other people in that friend group, because the chances of it spreading within that friend group was really, really high, right? So this was them communicating. It moved online at one point, right? And there was a big thing in the 2000s about especially on Tumblr for weird reasons. Tumblr was a weird site. You had the Mia and Anna culture around bulimia and anorexia. Like bulimia, Mia is bulimia, Anna is anorexia, right? And people would promote the lifestyle online, and other people would find it on these Tumblr blogs and adopt this kind of, eating disorder. So these sociogenic illnesses spread via first the internet and now social media, right? Okay. So what Haidt suggests is this is kind of two processes kind of working together. For one, there's emotional contagion, right? We pick up the emotions of those around us, right? This is kind of empathy, right? It's kind of a helpful mechanism. It helps us sort of understand what people are feeling and work with them. And of course, as we said, this is much more easily spread by women than by men. The other one is prestige bias, right? Those who present with more extreme symptoms are going to gather more likes and followers to become models for others. Now, Haidt cites this kind of example. It's what's called the German Tourette's example. And happened, probably about, I think, 2012. Lots of young people, specifically in Germany, were showing up with Tourette's-like symptoms, but none of them have Tourette's. Now, Tourette's is really interesting because, and I do remember this kind of at the time, because my wife works in kind of the mental health part of the Catholic school board, and all of a sudden, everyone was talking about Tourette's. Tourette's is a really interesting thing because it's actually a brain disorder, right? If you look at a brain on a CAT scan, you can see what's causing the Tourette's, right? It's a brainstem disorder. It's not something that you can manifest for any other reason, not if it's genuine Tourette's, right? It's actually really quite simple to detect if you know what you're looking at. And so, all these people start to manifest these Tourette symptoms, right? Outbursts of speech, typically. When they did the look at the brain scans, none of them actually had Tourette's. And it was, I don't want to say it's funny, but it is a little bit funny because it seems to stem from this one influencer that was on social media and manifested some kind of Tourette symptoms, whether they're authentic or not, where she would randomly yell "Heil Hitler," right? Not exactly a great thing to yell, and always a little worried that me just saying those words is going to get this stream blocked on YouTube, but whatever. So what's interesting is that obviously this is kind of, really provocative, right? It's a really weird set of symptoms. And so a lot of other young people in Germany started to manifest these same Tourette symptoms, but it's the same phrase, right? Heil Hitler. All of them were saying Heil Hitler. And that's not Tourette's either, right? Tourette's, everybody's going to have a slightly different manifestation of it. It's not like everybody has the same manifestation. So the German researchers wrote that they had the first outbreak of a new type of mass sociogenic illness that, in contrast to all previously reported episodes, is solely spread via social media, right? Because most of the people who manifested these things didn't know each other. They only interacted through social media. So accordingly, we suggest the more specific term, mass social media-induced illness. Okay, we've seen this a lot as well. I think it's died down a little, but for a while, you saw this all over TikTok, where people were manifesting the symptoms of dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, right? And you had a whole bunch of influencers talking about their system, right? It's like, oh, this personality in my system. And this seems to have led to an uptick in people reporting dissociative identity disorder. And again, dissociative identity disorder is a very, very specific psychological disorder. And it tends to manifest only in cases of extreme trauma, especially childhood sexual trauma. It's not something that you just randomly get, right? It's not like schizophrenia where there's a biological component. It's really a solely psychological thing, right? And it seems to have to do with a sort of breaking of the psyche, especially at a very, very young age. And so it's not something that you tend to just spontaneously develop, right? But we've seen lots of people manifesting symptoms of DID on social media. Now, I think all of these people genuinely, like the German Tourette's folks and the people talking about dissociative identity disorder on TikTok, all genuinely believe that this is happening to them. It's just a sociogenic illness being spread by social media, right? So social media has the potential to spread a lot of things amongst girls in particular, right? It's really powerful in that way. And we've seen a lot of this, like depression, anxiety spreading a lot, and then other more extreme things, which make for really interesting examples, but aren't the whole of it, right? There's much more mundane things being spread by social media as well. Okay. This one is pretty easy. I can do this one fast. All right, girls are more subject to predation and harassment online, right? So, ow, my ring is loud. In many regions of the online world, of no surprise to anyone, adult men prey on teen and preteen girls, right? So it's easy for, this is right from, so this is from Nancy's book. Nancy Jo Sales wrote a book called American Girls. I swear to God, I read this book and it's still, some of the things that's in that book still give me chills. Just what teenage girls were dealing with. And the book's a little dated now, so I'm sure it's even worse today, right? What does Nancy say? It's easy for older predators to go online and just find a girl, right? Because girls want the most friends, right? Follower counts. Having a high follower count means you're likely to give access to a lot of people to your social media, right? They want the most followers and likes. So if someone tries to friend them, they'll just friend them back right away without even knowing who they are, right? And I think people have gotten a little bit smarter about this and put their social media to private, right? Especially Instagram, but it's definitely still there. So even if it's a serial killer, they still friend them back, may even start talking to them. It's scary, especially since a lot of girls will post pictures of themselves in bras and bathing suits, and people they friend back can see those pictures, right? And I mean, I talked about this last class, so I won't belabor it, right? But predators know where kids are, right? So people go to apps where there's a social component, like Club Penguin and Roblox, looking to, friend kids and sort of groom them online by sending them the gifts and all sorts of things like this, right? And eventually working towards either getting them to send like explicit content via the internet, which has happened, right? And you can look up cases like Amanda Todd, who did in fact do that and then was harassed by this person who she had sent it to, basically until she took her own life. Or actually try to arrange in-person meetings with these girls, right? Okay. Now, this one, she suggests their male peers also prey on them by demanding nudes, which may open girls up to even more social risk, right? Now, like I said, Nancy Jo Sales talks about this in her book, American Girls. This was one of them that I wasn't aware of when I read the book, and it sort of shocked me how, boys would sort of compete to see if they could get girls in their classes to send them nudes, right? And it was something that they it was a status thing, right? It became a status thing whether you could get nudes from girls in your class, and they would push really, really hard. And then, and what Sales says is boys that you would normally think would be like really nice, polite boys would often admit to having collections of images of their classmates, and those collections were shared between the boys, right, as sort of status tokens, right? So this is definitely, their peers are preying on them as well, and obviously it opens them up to things like revenge porn, right? Their pictures being posted in public forums, if there's a breakup or, a social incident. So there's a lot of pressure to do this, but at the same time, a lot of social risk for girls, right? And yeah, social predation and exploitation is rampant on social media. And in a lot of cases, the social media companies, because it's actually quite difficult for them to track, and the bar to creating the accounts for these sites is so low, they sort of half-heartedly battle this, but not really. Okay, I'll say very famously, the porn companies have been taken to task for this, Pornhub and all of the affiliated companies, because they were just rampant with revenge porn, and they did absolutely nothing about it until they faced billions of dollars in sort of legal settlements if they didn't take it more seriously. Okay. How the time goes. So, quantity over quality. Social media, what does it do? Well, obviously it increases the number of connections that people have, but what Haidt says, and I think this is correct, right? And I think you see this, in the overall data and the stuff I've shown you so far, it reduces the quality of those connections. And what you have is more weak ties, right? People who have a loose social connection to, right, that kid you went to elementary school with who's on your socials. But fewer strong ties because you're spending less time with people building really, really strong ties, right? And you see it in this chart, right? Have a few close friends, right? The number of close friends, the number of boys and girls saying that they have a few close friends is declining, and feelings of loneliness, are increasing at the same time. So you've cut back in-person social time, you have more online time, and relationships and the quality of those relationships have suffered. Okay, let's clear this comment. I don't want to hear it. All right, what's happening to boys? And we'll definitely continue this next time. What I do have, finally, my boy crisis slides ready. That was my task for today, and they're up on Canvas. So we'll do this, and then we'll jump into those after. Okay, so boys have followed a somewhat different path to girls. So internalizing disorders, girls have more of them, right? So things like depression and anxiety, we see more of that in girls. Boys have suffered too, and the rates of internalizing disorders have gone up, but not as much. But what we see with boys more is that there's real evidence of them pulling away from engagement in the real world, right? So their time with friends started to decline. It's declined for both. It started to decline with boys earlier than it did with girls, right? Now, girls have largely caught up, but it started with boys earlier, and that's video games, right? So video games, especially online multiplayer games, became a real force for boys probably in the early 2000s, right? Once you got high-speed internet as much cheaper and much more available. For girls, it starts with social media. So they caught up, but the decline is more compressed between our years of like 2010 and like the present, right? So it's a much more squished down timeline. So that line looks a lot sharper. But again, boys are in the same place. They just started a little bit earlier. All right, and this is a fun chart, right? Percent saying they have no chance at life, right? And you see boys have always thought they had no chance of a successful life more than girls, but it really jumps up here, right, to like 12, 13% of boys, where it's still sort of sub 10% for girls. Okay, so we've talked about this a little bit already in the course, but some big changes in the world have affected boys in particular. All right, so real world changes starting in the 1970s, right? Those are all those economic trends we talked about back in the work unit, right? Where we talked about, declines in manufacturing and all of these sorts of, strength-based jobs, movement to a more service-based economy. That's affected men more than women. I'll get into that a lot more when we do the next unit, right, on the crisis of boys and men. But it's made the world tougher for boys and young men. There are fewer careers than there were that are really tailored to a lot of their, especially the working class and more kinetically oriented boys, their sort of orientations, and they struggle more in the service-based economy than women do. And, we'll dig into it a little bit more, like I said, in a bit, but many feel now purposeless and kind of adrift. Now, you remember, we talked about those two kinds of orientations, right? Towards kind of community or communion and towards agency. The digital world, right? Video games in particular, creates a way for boys to do agency building. Activities, right? Competing, playing war, mastering skills, and of course, seeing naked women, right? All on increasingly portable screens. Okay, so all of these things, right? Boys, like I said earlier, are a little bit more oriented towards agency building, right? So being able to do things, right, get really, really good at something has big rewards. And increasingly, right, that is video games. Now, if you spend hundreds of hours playing a video game, you are likely to get considerably better at that game, right? You're going to build a lot of capacity. And as you do, as you get better at something, you're going to feel good, right? Now, if you've ever wondered why, it's not just for shits and giggles that a platform like Fortnite or Rocket League, or I'm assuming Overwatch, and I'm assuming all of them are similar, have rank systems, right? It's to reward the effort you put into getting better at the game, right? So you can move up from bronze to grand champ or whatever, right, as you improve at these games. Right? And that makes you feel agency. So they're purposely kind of using boys' natural orientation, not against them, but to keep them engaged, right? And of course, right, pornography has allowed boys to sort of skip a lot of the hard work, of becoming socially competent, talking to women and girls, in order to get, to the end stage, if you will, by just like going on and looking at pornographic images. Okay. So, men's general fortunes, right? We can talk about stagnating wages or, less labor force participation for men has been declining since the 70s, largely caused by structural economic changes, right? Automation, globalization, and simply, mostly those two things, right? Automation and globalization has taken away a lot of the jobs that men used to really thrive in, right? Or at least have good economic prospects. Heavy labor, especially in agriculture and manufacturing, has been replaced by the service industry, and women seem just dispositionally better oriented towards a lot of service-based jobs than men are. Okay, and this from a different book. It's from this book, right? So this is The End of Sex, Hannah Rosen. For the first time in American history, the balance of workforce has tipped towards women who continue to occupy around half the nation's jobs. And here, right, at every educational levels, girls are surpassing boys. Boys get lower grades, they have higher rates of ADHD, more likely to be unable to read, and they are less likely to graduate from high school, in part because they're 3 times as likely as girls to have been expelled or suspended. And those effects are most obvious down the socioeconomic ladder, in the working class in particular. But you can have a double disadvantage if you're, like in the US especially, if you're working class and black, right? That there's racial components to this as well. And here, one of the things that Reeve says, kind of towards the end of his book, is his contention is that a world of floundering men is unlikely to be a world of flourishing women. And just like at a basic level, some of the contention here is that men and women, to some extent, kind of need each other, right? They're complementary. There's good things about being in relationships with each other. And it's hard for women to find good men when men are floundering, right? We talked about the decline in marriageable men. This is largely it. So if you want to be in a relationship, this is kind of an important question all over the place. Okay, are the gender disparities also impacted by sexuality? I mean, geez, I'd have to dig into that. I know, like, at some economic level, gay men like outperform to a tremendous extent. But off the top of my head, I simply can't remember the answer to that question. I will see if I can find that. So I will leave that comment up. Okay. So I got 3 minutes. Some of the causes, right? So declines in jobs that reward strength. Talked about that already. An educational system that prizes the ability to sit still and listen. And often people will point to the fact that most teachers are women. Like Leonard Sachs has pointed at this in a book called Why Gender Matters, though he's recanted some of it a little bit. He advocated for a long time single-sex education, and he's pulled back on that a little bit in subsequent editions of the book. But suggesting that, in certain ways, female teachers struggled to teach boys in ways that were engaging to boys. They were really good at teaching girls, but just the different orientations made it really a little bit difficult to figure out ways of engaging boys. And he has lots of cool examples of things that worked for boys. Teaching a book like Treasure Island by having the boys actually create a map of the island rather than just reading it and talking about it. Right, it was much more engaging to boys. A decline in the availability of positive male role models, including fathers, right? We talked about this a little bit when we talked about families. We'll talk about it again, but there are a lot of communities, especially again, down that socioeconomic ladder, where fathers are largely absent, right? Where there's a large number of young people being raised without fathers, so boys struggling to construct positive images of masculinity and being more vulnerable to antisocial forces like gangs. Okay, and then also some psychological factors, right? Safetyism, less time outside, less time to build agency in the world, right? Get scrapes, get into fights with kids twice your size, and all of that kind of stuff. And more online multiplayer games, which again has the potential of reducing, quality of connections, quality of adult connections, number of adult connections. Less time in institutions means less of those caring adults, right, that we talked about earlier in the course. I have 1 minute. I cannot do the slide in 1 minute. Let's pause here. I'm almost done-ish. I'm lying. Oh, I will have to check that. I still don't know the answer to that question. Okay, I'm close to being done this, and then we'll jump into boys a little bit more and round out the course with some truly depressing stats, because everything so far has been absolutely cheerful. We'll see you on Wednesday. We're almost done. Huzzah.